The rain had just started to fall when the city lights flickered on, their glow stretching across glass towers and the dark veins of narrow streets. The night carried the weight of ordinary life, people rushing home with bags of groceries, taxis honking as they weave through traffic, and the low hum of voices spilling out from restaurants where laughter tried to drown out the day's exhaustion. On the surface, it looked like any other night, nothing remarkable, nothing to set it apart. But inside one office high above the city, in a room built from wealth and power, the first cracks of a story that would shake lives to their core were beginning to show. The office was polished to perfection, the kind of space meant to impress anyone who walked through its doors. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the city below, while marble floors reflected the glow of gold-plated lamps. It was the kind of room that belonged to someone who had clawed his way to the top and wanted everyone to know he'd made it. Behind a desk that seemed more like a monument than furniture sat a man who had built his empire not only with business sense, but with intimidation. To most people, he was untouchable. He was the face of power, the kind of man whose name carried weight in boardrooms and struck fear in employees who never looked him in the eye for too long. But tonight, that same man's hands were trembling. His voice, usually sharp and steady, cracked under pressure. Somewhere between pride and panic, his tone dropped to something almost childlike. His world, so carefully constructed, was about to meet someone who did not belong to it, someone whose life ran on an entirely different rhythm. A single father who had known struggle not in numbers on a screen, but in the aching emptiness of unpaid bills and the heavy silence of nights spent alone with a child who asked questions he didn't always have answers for. Their worlds could not have been further apart, yet fate had a way of pressing them together in a room where power would suddenly shift. Before that night, both men had been living lives that looked predictable in their own ways. The CEO's days were measured in meetings, handshakes, and headlines. His smile was wide when cameras flashed, but behind closed doors, his temper was notorious. Those who worked closest to him knew the sharp sting of his words, the way he demanded perfection, yet offered no humanity in return. Still, they stayed. People always stayed around men like him, because leaving meant giving up opportunities they'd never find again. That was the cruel trade-off. Wealth and connections on one side, dignity and peace on the other. The single dad lived in a small apartment across town, its walls marked with the small scuffs of a child's growing years. Toys were tucked into corners, drawings taped to the fridge as if they were priceless works of art. He worked long hours, the kind of jobs that left him drained but never fully secure. Every paycheck was stretched thin, yet he found a way to keep food on the table, shoes on his child's feet, and hope alive even when life felt relentless. His world was not built on marble or glass, but on sacrifice and the quiet, stubborn strength of love. No one could have guessed that these two lives, one wrapped in money and control, the other in struggle and tenderness, would collide. But life has a way of stripping illusions, exposing truths we spend years trying to hide. The cracks were already there in the CEO's perfect life. Rumors whispered among employees, late-night arguments behind closed doors, the quiet ache of someone who had everything yet seemed to feel nothing at all. Power had fed his pride, but it had also left him empty, hollow in ways he could never admit. And when emptiness meets anger, it grows into something dangerous. For the single father, the cracks were different. They came in the form of exhaustion, of carrying too much on his shoulders, the fear of not being enough, of failing the only person who looked at him like he was the world. He carried his pain silently, choosing not to burden others, but silence doesn't erase the weight. It only makes it heavier. Somewhere in the spaces between these two men, a storm was gathering. On that night, in that office, the roles they thought they understood, rich and poor, powerful and powerless, were about to twist. And once they did, there would be no going back. The city carried on as though nothing was wrong, but inside that tower of glass and stone, the air was heavy, waiting for something to break. A plea was whispered into the quiet, words no one would expect to hear from a man like him. words that turned the atmosphere cold, as if the walls themselves were listening. And somewhere outside, far from the polished floors and golden lamps, a father's steady determination was about to change everything. The weeks that followed that first tense night seemed ordinary to outsiders, but inside both men's lives, small moments of unease began to grow into something larger. The CEO returned to his world of contracts and boardrooms, but something had shifted. His confidence was cracked, his sense of control no longer absolute. He carried himself with the same authority in public, but behind closed doors his temper flared more often, and his paranoia crept in like a shadow he could not shake. He had tasted fear, real fear, and for a man who had spent his life believing no one could touch him, it was poison. For the single father, the encounter had lit something raw inside. He was a man who had lived through loss, through nights where the silence after his child went to bed was filled with worry he couldn't silence. He had always endured, bending beneath the weight of responsibility but never breaking. Yet standing in that office, seeing a man of wealth and power stripped of his armor, had awakened an anger he didn't know he carried. It wasn't just about what the CEO had done or said, it was about every injustice he had lived through, every time the world seemed to favor the powerful, while men like him were left to scrape by. Their paths crossed again, as if pulled together by something inevitable. It started with small encounters, words exchanged that carried too much meaning, looks that lingered too long. The CEO began testing boundaries, sometimes speaking with false kindness, other times with cutting cruelty, as if he couldn't decide whether he feared or despised the man who had seen him vulnerable. The single dad, on the other hand, felt himself pulled into a dangerous game. He didn't trust the CEO, but there was something about watching him stumble between arrogance and fear that made him unwilling to look away. Rumors swirled among employees at the company. The CEO's behavior grew more erratic. He snapped at meetings, made rash decisions, and seemed constantly distracted. People noticed, but no one dared to speak openly. Those who worked for him knew better. They kept their heads down, whispering only when doors were closed. Still, whispers have a way of traveling, and soon stories of his decline reached ears outside the office. Investors began to worry. Rivals watched closely, sensing weakness. The single father, meanwhile, carried his own burdens. Bills piled up, his child's school fees loomed, and the exhaustion etched deeper into his face. But layered beneath the ordinary struggles was a secret, the memory of a past mistake that still haunted him. It was the kind of mistake that could destroy what little stability he had built, a truth he never wanted his child to know. That secret became a silent pressure, pushing him to make choices he might otherwise have avoided. The more their lives tangled, the more volatile the air between them became. One night, in a dimly lit bar, the two men crossed paths outside the boundaries of the office. The CEO, already drinking heavily, let his mask slip completely. His words dripped with bitterness, insults buried in false humor. The single dad, already on edge from his own struggles, pushed back. Voices rose, hands tightened into fists, but the moment stopped short of violence. Still, the damage was done. Both men walked away with a deeper loathing, the kind that doesn't fade but festers. From that night forward, there was no turning back. The CEO began to obsess over the single father, unable to accept that someone so far beneath him socially could rattle his confidence. He dug into his background, searching for flaws, for weaknesses he could exploit. Power had always been his weapon, and he wielded it now with precision. Yet the more he uncovered, the more unsettled he became. The single father's life was not easy, but it was real, built on sacrifice and survival. It made his own existence, padded with money and status, seem hollow in comparison. That realization only fueled his rage. The single dad, too, found himself caught in the pull of obsession. He hated what the CEO represented, Yet he couldn't ignore the strange satisfaction of watching him unravel. Every slip, every desperate outburst felt like proof that the mighty could fall. But there was danger in that satisfaction. His anger began bleeding into other parts of his life. His patience with his child wore thin. His nights grew restless, and he carried himself with an edge that those around him could feel. Subplots tightened around them like invisible strings. Old grievances resurfaced. The CEO's estranged family, who had long resented his coldness, began circling like vultures, sensing his vulnerability. The single father's past mistakes, debts unpaid, promises broken, threatened to resurface at the worst possible time. Both men found themselves cornered, their private battles feeding into the larger storm brewing between them. The city carried on, indifferent to the silent war. But inside those towers, in late-night meetings and tense encounters, the line between control and collapse thinned. The CEO's paranoia turned violent in small ways, slamming doors, shoving papers, his voice breaking into shouts that made his staff flinch. The single father, once careful and steady, began to take risks he never would have before. He spoke with sharpness, challenged authority, and stepped closer to danger. The tension built like pressure in a sealed room, waiting for the smallest spark. Every glance, every word, carried the weight of something unspoken, and beneath it all, both men carried the quiet knowledge that this path could only end one way. Something would break. The night the crime unfolded was thick with tension, the kind of air that felt too heavy to breathe. The city outside pulsed with its usual life, horns echoing down the avenues, laughter spilling from bars, the glow of neon lights bleeding into the dark. But inside the CEO's office, the atmosphere was entirely different. It was past midnight, the building nearly empty, save for the low hum of security cameras and the distant buzz of fluorescent lights. The office, once pristine, was cluttered with half-empty glasses and papers scattered across the desk, a sign of how far the man had fallen. The CEO sat slouched in his chair, his face red from alcohol, his tie loosened, his eyes wild with a mixture of fury and fear. He had called the single father there under the guise of settling things once and for all. But nothing about the night felt like resolution. The moment the father stepped through the door, the air changed. There was no handshake, no exchange of pleasantries. Just silence, thick and unyielding, broken only by the sound of rain tapping against the glass windows. The father's eyes scanned the room, its excess, its coldness, and then landed on the man behind the desk. He saw not power, but desperation. The CEO's voice cracked when he spoke, rising and falling between insults and pleading, as though he couldn't decide whether to fight or beg. "You think you're better than me," he spat, his words slurred. "You think because you've seen me weak, you can take everything from me." The father's jaw tightened. He hadn't come for violence, but months of tension had brought him here, standing in this room like an intruder in another man's kingdom. He thought of his child at home, sleeping in a small bed, trusting him to keep the world safe. He thought of the nights spent hungry, of the bills he could barely pay, of the humiliation he had endured while men like the one in fee, front of him feasted. Something inside him snapped. The CEO rose suddenly, knocking over a glass that shattered across the marble floor. His rage was uncontained now. He lunged across the desk, his hand gripping the father's shirt, pulling him close. "I could ruin you," he hissed, his spit hitting the man's cheek. "One word, and everything you love is gone." For a split second, time froze. The father's breath hitched, his heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the rain. His mind raced. "Leave now. Walk away. Don't do it." But another voice, darker, louder, drowned the reason out. He shoved the CEO back, hard. The older man stumbled against the desk, his face twisting with shock and rage. He reached for something, a paperweight, heavy and sharp, its polished surface glinting under the lamplight. His intention was clear. Instinct took over. The father grabbed his wrist, the two struggling in a violent tangle of limbs and breath. The sound of grunts, of shoes scraping against the slick floor filled the room. The paperweight clattered to the ground, but the fight didn't stop. The CEO clawed at him, his voice breaking into a high, panicked plea. "Please! Don't hit me!" Those words, the ones no one would expect to hear from a man like him, hung in the air. For a brief moment the father faltered, his grip loosening. But then he thought of every time he'd been pushed down, every time men like this one had laughed while he struggled. The rage that had simmered for months, maybe even years, exploded. He struck. Once. Twice. The sound was sickening, the kind of sound that lingers long after the act. The CEO fell, his body crumpling against the floor, his blood seeping into the cracks of the marble. The room went quiet, except for the father's ragged breaths, his hands trembling as he looked down at what he had done. His heart raced, his vision blurred, and for a moment he thought it wasn't real. But the lifeless body before him told the truth. Panic set in. He staggered back, nearly slipping on the glass shards. His chest heaved as he tried to think, to piece together what had just happened. The weight of it crashed down on him. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. He thought of his child, of what this would mean, of how their life would never be the same. His stomach twisted, bile rising in his throat. He crouched down, his shaking hands hovering over the body, as if he might undo it somehow, as if pressing against the wounds would bring life back. But nothing changed. The CEO's face, once so alive with arrogance and fire, was pale and slack, his eyes staring into nothing. The father wiped his bloody hands on his shirt, his mind spiraling. He thought about leaving, about running, but where would he go? His fingerprints were everywhere, his presence undeniable. He looked around the room, searching for something, anything that could cover what had happened. He moved the papers on the desk, swept the broken glass into the corner, and dragged the heavy body slightly as if rearranging it could change the reality of death. The harder he tried, the messier it became. The room smelled of iron and alcohol. The rain outside louder now, as though the world was mocking him. He whispered to himself over and over, "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." His voice cracked, his eyes burning. He wasn't a killer. He wasn't someone who planned this. But standing there, surrounded by silence and blood, he realized he was now something he had never wanted to be. Every second felt like an hour as he tried to gather himself. The adrenaline that had fueled his rage was fading, replaced by a hollow emptiness. His body trembled uncontrollably, sweat dripping down his temples, his breath shallow. He wanted to scream, to wake up from this nightmare, but the truth was etched into the cold floor beneath him. In those first moments after the crime, denial fought with reality. He told himself maybe the man wasn't dead. Maybe he was just unconscious. He pressed fingers to his neck, searching desperately for a pulse. But there was nothing. The silence confirmed what he already knew. The single father stood, his legs weak, his heart broken in ways he hadn't expected. He hadn't just killed a man. He had destroyed his own life, and with it, the life of the one person who depended on him most. The office, once a symbol of power, was now a tomb, and he was trapped inside it, caught between the man he had been and the one he had just become. The hours after the crime blurred together, a haze of panic and half-formed thoughts. The father stumbled out of the building with his shirt stained and his mind spinning, every step echoing with the memory of what had happened in that office. The rain that soaked him on the walk home did nothing to wash the guilt away. He barely remembered fumbling his keys into the lock of his apartment, barely remembered the small bodies stirring in the bedroom, his child's sleepy voice asking if he was okay. He answered with a lie, his voice shaking as he tucked the blanket tighter and kissed a forehead that smelled faintly of soap and innocence. For a moment, he stood in the doorway, staring at the child he loved more than anything, and he felt the crushing weight of what he had done. He had killed not just a man, but the life they had built together, the fragile hope he had been protecting. The next morning, the city woke to whispers that grew louder with every passing hour. The CEO had been found in his office, his body discovered by a cleaning staff member who screamed so loud it brought security running. By dawn, news crews swarmed outside the building, their cameras pointed toward the glass tower that had been his empire. Reporters spoke in rushed tones about the shocking death of a man so powerful, a man who had been both admired and feared. The details were scarce, but speculation filled the silence. Some suggested a business rival, others a lover, and many whispered that someone inside the company had finally snapped under his reign of terror. The father watched the news from his kitchen, his hands clenched around a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. The world outside was treating it like a mystery, but he knew the truth, and that truth was eating him alive. He couldn't escape the image of blood on marble, couldn't quiet the echo of those desperate words, "Please, don't hit me." They played on a loop in his head, a cruel reminder of the line he had crossed. He told himself it hadn't been planned, that it had been self-defense, an accident born from rage. But the more he repeated it, the less convincing it sounded. At work, whispers spread like wildfire. Employees who had once cowered before the CEO now spoke openly about his cruelty, about the way he had belittled them, broken them, left scars that weren't always visible. The company's image fractured overnight. Investors pulled back, clients withdrew, and the empire he had built began to collapse. Yet despite the stories of abuse, his death shocked the community. He had been powerful, untouchable, and now he was gone. For some, it was relief. For others, fear. If a man like him could fall, what did that mean for everyone else clinging to power, the father's? Life unraveled slowly, almost cruelly. At home, he struggled to keep the facade intact. His child sensed the change, the way he jumped at every knock on the door, the way he stared off into space, lost in thoughts too heavy to share. Nights became unbearable. Sleep brought nightmares of blood and pleading, while the silence of the early morning hours filled him with dread. He began drinking, just enough to dull the edge, but it never erased the weight of guilt. In the community, the story grew into something larger than either man. The CEO was painted in two lights, one of the ruthless businessman whose empire had destroyed lives, and another of the tragic figure brought down too soon. The contrast made his death a spectacle, feeding talk shows, newspapers, and endless debates online. People argued over whether he had deserved what happened, or whether anyone deserved to die that way. His reputation was torn apart and rebuilt in fragments, each person shaping it to fit their own version of the truth. For the father, there was no escaping the shadow of it. Even if no one knew yet, he carried the crime in every movement, every glance. Guilt seeped into his relationship with his child. He held them tighter, loved them harder, but every embrace was tinged with the knowledge that he might not be there for long. He thought about turning himself in, about confessing and ending the torment, but the thought of his child alone kept him silent. That silence was its own prison, trapping him in a cycle of fear and shame. The legal storm grew louder with each day. Detectives began piecing together the CEO's last hours, tracing phone calls, reviewing security footage, and questioning staff. The investigation moved like a tide, slow at first but relentless. The father's name wasn't spoken yet, but he felt the inevitability of it. Every knock at the door made his heart race. Every phone. A call left his hands shaking. He knew it was only a matter of time before the truth clawed its way into the open. Friends noticed the change in him. They asked if he was all right, if something had happened. He brushed them off with forced smiles and weak excuses, but behind the mask, he was drowning. Even the small joys of life, his child's laughter, the smell of dinner cooking, the sound of music playing on a neighbor's radio, felt dulled, overshadowed by the darkness he carried. He was present, but not alive. a ghost in his own home. Meanwhile, the CEO's family grieved in complicated ways. Some mourned sincerely, broken by his loss. Others, who had long suffered under his control, felt a confusing mix of sorrow and freedom. His death left them exposed, vulnerable to the vultures circling his estate, the lawsuits, the financial chaos. His empire, once untouchable, was now a carcass being picked apart. The ripple effects spread further than either man could have imagined. Employees who had endured his cruelty finally spoke out, some with anger, others with tears. Competitors used the chaos to their advantage, moving in on what was left of his business. The community debated morality and justice, asking questions that had no easy answers. Could a man who inflicted so much harm be mourned? Could the one who ended his life ever be forgiven? For the father, these questions became unbearable. He replayed the night in his mind, searching for moments where he could have walked away. He imagined 1,000 versions of himself, one that turned and left the office, one that stayed silent, one that found another way. But none of them existed anymore. Only the man who had done the unthinkable remained. Every day after the crime was a slow unraveling, threads pulled tighter until something would eventually give. He lived in denial, telling himself he could keep it hidden, but guilt is louder than silence. It gnawed at him in the quiet hours. It whispered to him in the faces of strangers. It haunted, but him in the eyes of his child. The aftermath was not just about the crime itself, but about the destruction of a life, a family, and a soul that could never be made whole again. The end did not come in a dramatic explosion, but in quiet steps that closed in slowly, day by day. Investigators followed the threads with patience, building a case that was careful and precise. The single father had lasted weeks in the shadow of what he had done, clinging to the fragile hope that maybe he could outrun it. Maybe he could live with it buried deep inside. But guilt has a way of leaving footprints, and those prints became impossible to hide. When the detectives finally came to his door, there was no fight, no protest. He looked at them with hollow eyes, nodded once, and let the cuffs close around his wrists. The courtroom was a stage, filled with faces that carried 1,000 judgments. Some looked at him with anger, others with pity, and some with confusion, as if they couldn't reconcile the image of a quiet father with the act of violence that had taken a life. The prosecution painted him as a man who had snapped, who had let his rage consume him until there was no turning back. The defense tried to show the other side, a man crushed by circumstance, cornered by a system that had failed him, a man who acted in desperation more than malice. The verdict came down like a hammer, heavy and absolute. He was found guilty, though the charge carried recognition of the struggle, of the fact that it had not been premeditated. The sentence was long enough to steal years from his life, but not so long as to erase him. He would not walk free for a long time, and his child, the one anchor he had held on to, would grow up in his absence. The judge's words were clear. Justice had to be served, but even justice could not untangle the pain left behind. For the child, the fallout was a wound that would never fully heal. They were shuffled between relatives, their world suddenly fractured. The father's absence became a silence louder than any words. Every school event, every birthday, every milestone carried the shadow of what had been lost. They would come to know their father through letters sent from prison, pages filled with regret, love, and the weight of a man trying to make sense of his own choices. Those letters, worn soft from rereading, became both a comfort and a reminder of everything that had been taken. The CEO's legacy was equally complicated. In death, the truth about his cruelty spilled into the open. Former employees came forward with stories of abuse, intimidation, and exploitation. The empire he had built crumbled under lawsuits, debts, and the vultures who fed on collapse. Yet in some circles, he was still remembered as a visionary, a man who had reached heights most never could. His family grieved, but even their grief was fractured. Some mourned deeply, others secretly felt relief that his reign had ended. Death had not turned him into a saint, nor had it erased the damage he had done. Public reaction was divided. Some saw the father as a monster who had taken a life, no matter the reasons. Others saw him as a tragic figure, a man who had been pushed too far by a society that favored the powerful and tears, left the vulnerable to suffer in silence. The debates raged on talk shows, across dinner tables, and in the comment sections of endless articles. The case became more than just a crime. It became a mirror held up to society, reflecting uncomfortable truths about inequality, power, and the way desperation can drive even the gentlest soul to violence. The story forced people to ask questions with no simple answers. What does justice mean when both lives, the one lost and the one condemned, were already broken in different ways? Can morality be drawn in straight lines when human behavior is shaped by fear, anger, and survival? The crime was not just about one man striking another. It was about the cracks in a system that pits wealth against poverty, power against powerlessness, until something inevitably breaks. In prison, the father transformed in quiet ways. Stripped of freedom, he faced himself fully for the first time. He carried guilt like a second skin, but he also found a strange kind of clarity. He wrote endlessly, letters to his child, journals no one else would read, confessions to a God he wasn't sure he believed in. He became a man haunted not just by what he had done, but by the knowledge that his love, the same love that had once kept him alive, had not been enough to stop his hand that night. The CEO, though gone, continued to influence the world he left behind. His fall became a cautionary tale in boardrooms, a reminder that power built on fear is fragile. His death fueled new conversations about workplace abuse, about how far people can be pushed before they break. But like all lessons, it was quickly diluted, softened into sound bites, remembered only by those who had truly lived through his shadow. In the end, there was no clean resolution, no victory. Justice was served in the way courts measure it, but justice of the heart was harder to find. The father lost his freedom, the child lost their innocence, the CEO lost his life, and the community lost its illusions. What remained were scars, some visible, most hidden, that told of a night where two men's lives collided in a storm neither could control. The story leaves behind questions that will never fully settle. Was the father's act a crime of rage, or the inevitable breaking point of a man pushed too far? Was the CEO a victim, or the architect of his own downfall? And what does it say about the rest of us, that we live in a world where desperation and arrogance can meet so violently? Perhaps the only truth is that humans are fragile, capable of both love and destruction, often in the same breath. Power can protect, but it can also corrupt. Love can save, but it can also be kind. And justice, though necessary, rarely heals. The story of that night is not just about a man who cried, "Please don't hit me," or a father who struck back. It is about the fragile line we all walk, the choices that define us, and the haunting truth that sometimes when worlds collide, no one walks away unscarred.